name is John Bailey, and I'm a member of the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom. And it blew a breath of fresh air in 1979 when I was working on Murdoch's papers. I'd been in Fleet Street for over 20 years, and I'd worked on over a dozen titles. And one of the things I never experienced in all of that time was freedom of the press. I never saw any instance of it once. I saw only proprietorial control. I saw bullied and weak journalists. And I saw print unions standing up for what should have been the right of every journalist, and that was the right of reply. When the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom introduced the right of reply, it was print unions that stood up to the proprietors and stopped the newspaper. And I have to say one of the highlights of my career was stopping The Sun on several occasions. On one occasion, the editor said to me, "You're interfering with the freedom of the press." And I said, "Whose freedom is that?" No answer, because it was Murdoch's freedom. No one else. It was entirely what he wanted. And all of those people who worked with him, who worked under him, who worked for him, were directly carrying out his wishes. And I don't exclude any of the titles I worked on, because it was quite clear that all the way through the line, people were working to a proprietorial control. And if there's any lesson to be learned from today, it's history. We can go back to 1599 and the start of the East India Company to see how Britain works, and we've heard some good examples today. But we only need to go back to Harmsworth, who started the Daily Mail after he bought the Evening News. He wanted to be known, and he was known as the chief by everybody. He knew exactly what he was doing when he launched the Mail and introduced tabloid journalism to this country. His brother, who was even more cute in a way, he was the expert. He was the financial expert. And he made sure that what tabloid newspapers were going to do was make a profit. And I just wonder sometimes about the English people. Do they not realise that Fleet Street publications and all the rest of them are about profit? They're not about news. They're not about informing you lot. I mean, all of the people that believe what they read in the papers are somewhere else. It isn't a question of what's newsworthy. It's a question of copy tasters. You don't hear much about those, do you? But they're the people who determine what comes into the newspaper by checking the copy before it goes anywhere, before anyone sees it. And these people have a direct line to know exactly what they're supposed to be doing. So the idea that in some way or other Fleet Street represents freedom of the press is absolute nonsense. There's no way in which it does. It represents the interest, the financial interest in particular, of people like Murdoch. And I remember on one particular occasion when we were confronted with Murdoch, we'd asked about the relevance of page 3 in a daily newspaper, a family newspaper, and he said, quote, "You can never underestimate British public taste." That's you. He could never underestimate your taste. And that's how he saw Great Britain. And it was a cash cow. All the money he earned in 1986 when he sacked me and 5,500 other people, he was taking £250,000 a week out of this country to launch Sky and to go into the States and get everything else sorted out there. I have to give him credit for seeing the future. He saw the future to be television, not printed newspapers. And the future is not printed newspapers. There's no question about it. It's dying on its feet. And I think in some ways, well, I can't be too sorry. And one thing that always surprises me about the time and effort that's gone into trying to regulate the press, trying to get people to behave properly. When I was a boy, I was told journalism was a calling. It was something you did because it gave an extra impetus to people. It rose people up from the normal, the average. And what I saw were cowardly, bullied individuals doing what they had to do because what everybody else had to do. That was to earn a living to pay the mortgage or whatever the middle class did in those days. I'm going back to the late 50s. So I don't see any difference now in terms of what newspaper owners do and what the rest of us do in terms of earning a living. Why it's got this exalted position in life, I do not understand. Yes, there are good journalists, and I've met many who've done some great work. But I know in many, many cases that great work has been hidden. For example, Geoffrey Dawson, who was editor of the Times in the 1930s, made sure that none of the comments coming from his correspondence in Germany ever reached the paper unless they were in accord with his and the government's view on appeasement. So there was the great thunderer, the Times newspaper, censoring itself. And even later on, in 1961, the editor of the New York Times, a man named Dreyfus, stopped any mention of the proposed invasion of Cuba by Kennedy that was coming in to him from his correspondence. So in terms of censoring the press, never mind about the proprietor, the editor would do the job if he thought it was expedient. And it followed the line that the government wanted. So this business of governments and publishers and all the rest of it, and proprietors being in league, is nothing new. It goes back to when newspapers first started. And it's particularly influential in this country. And I'll tell you a story about the News of the World. When I joined the News of the World in the late 60s, its circulation was 6.25 million, which meant it reached about 17 million readers, half the reading population of Great Britain. On one occasion, when there'd been a chemical factory fire in Flixbury in Norfolk, the front page, and the News of the World was then a tabloid, a broadsheet, was just a picture of smoke with a few firemen in the foreground. And this covered a huge area of the front page. And I said to the editor, will this work? Is this good enough? He said, don't worry, son. He said, if I said that red was blue and green was yellow, half my readers would believe it. So there you have a way in which, another further example, really, of the way in which British editors, British proprietors felt about their readers. They could never underestimate your public taste, and you believe everything they said. And you don't have to read the Mail. You don't have to read the Sun. You don't have to read the bloody Guardian either, which is a wolf in sheep's clothing. I think there's lots of ways in which the press could be an awful lot better in this country. But the habits and the nature and the way in which you can distribute newspapers across the whole country, from one or two locations, certainly until recently, and get that same front page on everyone's breakfast table, meant that the influence of newspapers was extraordinary. Nowhere in the world, except perhaps Sweden, was the influence of newsprint as viable and as valuable as it was in the UK. So that's how I view freedom of the press. I don't believe it's ever existed in the UK, and I don't think it ever will. I think there are ways in which the vestiges of the newspaper world and those journalists who do have some calling can be rescued, is by a series of outline processes that the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom has put together and has been submitted to Leveson. Now, Leveson is a mixed bag, really, and I don't suppose we can expect everything we want from Leveson, if anything at all, because the vested interests that want to develop beyond newsprint will make sure that their interests, I think, are pronounced. In fact, one of the worries, it seems to me, is that the internet, which does have the opportunity to offer a pluralism, a different approach, if one's careful, and I think that the concerns about the internet are overstated. I mean, if you're grown up, if you're sensible, you can find what you want. You don't have to rubbish yourself with the Mail online. You don't have to read it because everybody else reads it. If you're careful and you're selective, you can find what you want on the internet. And you can find writers and bloggers who will say something that actually does offer to change the situation, to make some of what we heard today real rather than just abstract and nominal. So I don't fear the internet. I don't fear the prospect of losing the printed word and having journalists put forward their ideas without the threat of proprietors, without the threat of editors and all the rest of them. So it's really important that we see what's being offered. And I think if you pick up Free Press today, and there's copies outside, you'll see that the areas that they've outlined are the ones on which I think we should all concentrate. Because there are options, and those options are fundamental, but they do make a great deal of sense. And the first one is ownership. What the CPBF are subscribing to is a maximum ownership of 15% across media. That's everything.
What's the CPBF?
The Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom. Well worth remembering. It's probably the oldest institution that campaigned for any change in the nature and the way in which the British press performed its obligations to the British people. And probably, certainly in my experience, was the only one operating for a long time. And it did operate very effectively. The right of reply which was first introduced by the campaign, was enacted across Fleet Street, as I said before, by print unions who held Murdoch to account and stopped his paper being produced. Now, this was amazing. This hadn't happened. This happened in the 70s and 80s. This hadn't happened since 1926, when the compositors at the Daily Mail refused to publish an editorial that condemned the people operating the general strike, the strikers, and were told they were guilty of treason. Now, this is the way the British newspaper world had elevated itself. So when you read about Cameron's association with Rebecca Brooks, who seems to me never to have written anything in her life, and becomes the world's leading journalist somehow or other, it's just beyond belief. But it's well believable in the context of the British media. It does make sense when you realise the internal workings of Fleet Street. And believe me, you've got to be in there. You've got to experience the bullying. You've got to experience the attitude, the machoism, and all the rest of it. And the craft-based trade unionism, of course. But all of this went together to produce a really vile and horrible circumstance that led to people, all of us, being fed this rubbish day after day after day, which has now imprisoned us in our thoughts. So today we've heard a great deal, which was, if it were extrapolated and fed out there, rather than the stuff we're force-fed every day about celebrities, football and the like, people would have a different view. People would see why women need a voice. People would see why most of the press is male-dominated. People would understand why politicians and proprietors are in bed with each other. Absolutely essential to make democracy as we have it work. Nothing to do with freedom of the press. Absolutely nothing. And I do take out of that context those people we've heard today, those journalists who do have some idea of what they should be doing and why they think it's important that their message about what they have discovered should be published and should be available to us. And the way forward, in my opinion, is through the internet. But coming back to the campaign for press and broadcasting freedom, they say ownership should be limited to 15% across media, and there should be a public interest test. Now, this would be adjudicated by Ofcom, not by Mr. whoever it is running the Department of Cultural and Media Circuses, I call it. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Someone like Hunt, for example. There should be regulation, and this regulation should involve the public, it should involve journalists, it should not involve the state or proprietary interests. But it should be state-funded to promote media freedom and standards and to adjudicate on complaints. So rather than have the facile Press Complaints Commission deciding for itself what's good or bad, or not deciding at all, as was most often the case, we would have somebody who would have the opportunity to investigate clearly and precisely those complaints that ordinary members of the people, ordinary members of the public are brought before them. So that's a very important point. There should be a code of conduct, the principles of a professional practice. Now we would restore something of what the NUJ and other bodies that represent journalists have really advanced for many, many years. The NUJ have had a code of conduct. And if 1% of the journalists I'd ever met in Fleet Street had practiced the code of conduct, we wouldn't have had the Bloody Sun or the Star. We would have had a decent newspaper that would have represented us all. We wouldn't have had to put up with the Daily Mail all these things forever, really. And women would have been a lot freer. And don't forget, the Daily Mail was not in favour of votes for women for a long, long time. So all of these factors need to be taken into account when one thinks about spending hard-earned cash on a British newspaper. Anyway, there should be statutory powers to enforce regulations and adjudications as a last resort. Statutory powers. Well, if you read any of the newspapers today, you'll see that this is the end of the world. In some way or other, if the press is regulated, we're all dead. It's the finish of everything. Well, the BBC, ITV, broadcasting has been regulated ever since day one. What's the problem? We've seen what's happened with the Savile inquiry. We've seen what's happening with Newsnight now. Well, this is fair enough. It's brought to public attention. There will be adjudication. People will suffer, hopefully, and the matter will be in some way resolved. But we do need somebody to press those buttons to get that statutory power. And we need a clear definition of public interest. We need that based on the PCC code of practice, and we need to enforce it on the basis of what I've said before. And finally, what we need is a conscience clause. So all those journalists that had to suffer under the yoke of Murdoch and Paul Dacre presently at the Mail and so on and so forth would say, no, I'm not doing it. Ethically, it's wrong. I refuse to obey that particular instruction. I'm not prepared to see my copy distorted or edited in that way. So that there would be some way in which journalists could stand up for what they are supposed to be doing. And that's providing you and me and everyone else with a clear, concise way in which the news should be formulated and should appear in front of you in a truthful way. Thank you very much.